Good morning. Good morning to those of you joining us online. We're so excited that you are with us in this way. And my name's Anthony. I'm the lead pastor here for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. And then for those of you who, if you admit it, you sometimes are like, man, I don't remember the name of that new pastor. My name's Anthony. I probably don't remember your name either, so it's okay. Grace can go both ways. But we are in our second week of a series we started last week called God of All Seasons. Last week we talked about the different seasons of life that each of us kind of walk through. And like the actual seasons, there are things that are kind of beautiful about each season, but there's also things that are unique to each season. And sometimes God is working in a very specific way in the season. But we don't choose the seasons all the time. We can't choose them, we can't control them, and we can't avoid them. We sort of surrender ourselves to the season and to the work God wants to accomplish in it. And sometimes that can be a challenge, but it's in that we can see that everything is beautiful in its season. And we've been looking at the wisdom writings of the teacher in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to go there this morning again. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. I will be reading from the New Living Translation, and the Bibles in front of you are the New Living Translation. If you want to look and read along, that's awesome, or if you have a device, you can look there as well. As Zach mentioned, the Bible app, the YouVersion Bible app, you can go to the events feature and find the scriptures and some sermon notes if you want to check that out. That's in the YouVersion Bible app. But I'll be reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We'll begin in verse 1. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do people really get for all their hard work? I have seen the burden God has placed on us all, yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So I concluded there's nothing better than to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. And people should eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labor, for these are gifts from God. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to cry and a time to laugh. A time to grieve and a time to dance. These phrases, if taken as a whole, aren't exactly feel-good statements. If you focus on just the born and the laugh and the dancing part, they're awesome. But they're sort of counteracted by that whole time to die and time to cry and time to grieve part. And the reality is that each one of us, at some point in our lives, we are going to walk through and experience loss. That our lives will be touched by the brokenness in this world. And the truth is, all of us, unless Jesus returns, will also die. There's a time to die. I know it's not really a feel-good message. This isn't really a pick-me-up, but sadly, it's relevant. There's this study done, this research, and it found that this was before the pandemic, back in 2019, that there's somewhere around 57%, estimated based on their survey, 57% of Americans were grieving a significant major loss within a 3-year time frame. Like major loss, like a spouse, a child, a close relative or friend. 57% before the pandemic. And then since the pandemic, there's an estimated 5 million people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. Different cultures sort of memorialize and have different rituals for memorializing the loss of a loved one. A lot of non-Western cultures actually have really elaborate and lengthy things and rituals that they go through when they lose a loved one. And this allows the family a significant time to process the grief. One of the criticisms that is sometimes made of our American Western culture is we sort of don't like to talk about death. And we sort of avoid it. And we sort of want to just get over it or around it or whatever. The whole process of grieving we sort of want to skip. One blogger sort of pointed out that even our term of "they passed away" sort of sidesteps the reality of saying they died. And I've observed that we sort of want to fast-track grief. I've even talked with people and they say things, I'm not sure where they get this idea, but man, I should be over it by now. And sometimes I feel, and I actually say to them, no, you shouldn't. You actually should be grieving. You should take the time you need to process and heal from that grief. We often say things sometimes to people also. I think they get the idea that they should be over it, because sometimes I think we say things in our culture that people should sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be positive and move forward and get over it. And, if you have to go to the funeral on Friday during work hours, then go you must. But make sure you clock back in on Monday and let's get on with the real business of things. And sometimes I feel like the church isn't always much better, because sometimes I think we might give people the impression that because we have hope of heaven, if you really had faith in Jesus, you're sort of impervious to loss as a Christian, right? I just want to say that is not true. There is a time to cry. There is a time to grieve. Impossibly, there's no time like the present. All of us, collectively, over the last 19 months, have experienced significant loss to one degree or another. I made a list of things that I felt like we had lost as a family because of the pandemic. And I want to be very clear, this is not meant to compare with anything anyone else has lost, and there's some that have lost much more than we have. But I just made a quick list of what came to mind. A couple of congregants at my previous church died, and they weren't my family members, but it impacts you when someone who's part of your community dies. We lost time. We lost time with family and friends. We lost time at playgrounds and the zoo and other fun memory-making activities we usually do as a family. I won't forget walking outside and walking by playgrounds that had caution tape around them and trying to explain to my son why we couldn't play at the playground. It was such a weird thing to try to process with your child. We lost the opportunity to celebrate my daughter's first birthday with family and friends because her birthday is March 25th of 2020. There were ministries I was excited about that just lost momentum. We lost friends over disagreements concerning COVID, and to be honest with you, I still don't even fully know why our friendship dissolved. I'm not 100% sure where the breakdown was. I was supposed to take a sabbatical in 2020, and I was going to go to, I had a trip to Israel that I was going to go to. It was kind of a dream, one of those bucket list things, and I will go when there's opportunity again, but I was going to go in 2020, and that got canceled. And again, I want to be clear, there's so many that have lost so much more. There are high school and college seniors that lost a graduation celebration. Kids lost meaningful connections with their friends at school. Some of those relationships. I was talking to some parents beforehand where some of their kids who were like part of preschool and then graduated and went to a different school, they never really got to say bye to they haven't seen some of their friends from that previous class. Some people lost jobs. Some kids of all ages, adult kids, lost a parent. Some people lost a spouse, a sibling, a friend. And then there's some people I know who they didn't die from COVID. They got better, but they've had this weird long-term COVID effects, things that are still, and so they've lost their health where it was before. They lost that. It's not the same after. They have bizarre things they're still walking through. We've all experienced some level, some degree of loss over the last 19 months. Our family has been in sort of a fall season. Last week I talked about the fall season of being a season of loss and transition. And I want to be clear, like fall, some of those transitions are really beautiful, like the leaves changing colors. It's such a beautiful time of year. But with that transition, sometimes there's a bit of loss. And part of our fall season has been our transition here. And I want to be very, very, very clear. We are so absolutely thrilled and overjoyed to be a part of Life Point Community. And God orchestrated things for our coming here, and especially in relation to the selling of our house and the buying of our house. God orchestrated things in so many ways. I can't even recount all those ways to you now. But Warsaw, we had lived there for 10 years, and it will always be the place that us newlyweds had our first apartment. Our first apartment is in Warsaw. It's the place where we brought home our kids. It's where we bought our first home. It's where I pastored at my first church. There's some of the friendships as a married couple we developed as a couple, not our first friendships ever. That'd be sad, right? Our first friendships as a married couple, some of them were forged there in Warsaw. And so it will always be sort of that place where a host of memories were. And a couple weeks ago, actually it's probably almost a month and a half ago, my wife was feeling a little bit sad about our transition and some of the things. And in particular, we had sold our house. We hadn't closed on it. That's another story. I'd tell you over coffee sometime. But we'd sold our house and put an offer that was accepted on a Goshen house. And my wife was feeling a little bit sad about the things at our Warsaw house that our Goshen house didn't have. And she was also just feeling sad about other things. And I was not a good husband. I essentially felt like at best she was being negative, and at worst she was being ungrateful for the house God just provided us. And stop being sad about it. Move on and get over it. She's like, I'm sorry. Just get on and move on it. And I made it sound spiritual, though, right? I didn't just say get on, move on it. We need to be thankful for the way God provided this house, and I'm excited, and you're, raining on my parade. I'm excited about this, and you need to be excited too. Well, fast forward a couple weeks, and Emily and I are in our home, our Warsaw home, and gathering up just the last odds and ends, and she's cleaning things for the people to move in, and we do a last walkthrough through our home. And all of a sudden, memories of bringing our kids home, and memories of tucking my kids in bed in their room, and memories of running around the island we had in our kitchen playing Tickle Monster. They just started flashing before my mind like a photo reel. And I often feel like I have whiplash emotions. I don't know if this is a guy thing, a personality thing. I don't know, but I have delayed emotional responses sometimes, and I don't know that I do until it happens. So these memories are flashing before my mind, and I just break and start crying. And it started out as a little tear shedding, and then it just turned into a straight up ugly man cry. And my wife, who is much more gracious and loving than I am, did not tell me to stop being sad and get over it and move on. She hugged me and said, "It's okay. Let it out." And so maybe she's not, always totally holy in her motives. I think there was a little part of her that knew it was coming. And she was just waiting for it. And so there was also that satisfaction. She was right. She knew I would break eventually. But she didn't try to encourage me to move on. She just let me experience sort of that grief and that sadness and just that moment of remembering what that house had meant to us. There's an author, Mark Brackett, in his book Permission to Feel. He writes that our emotions can prompt the release of beneficial neurochemicals and hormones. Crying is soothing because it carries stress hormones out of our bodies. Feelings of gratitude increase oxygen levels in our tissues, speed healing, and boost our immune system. In one study, laughter caused by watching a comedy film increased the flow of beta endorphins, which enhance our mood and stimulate growth hormones, which repair our cells. Even the anticipation of laughter was found to lower levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and adrenaline. And laughter may also reduce the risk of heart attack. This author, as far as I know, he's not a Christian, so he would look at it and say, man, look how profoundly the human body is. And I would say, look how God has designed us. Crying is a way that God has designed for stress hormones to be released out of the body. My main point this morning, and what I want to communicate to you, is that it is okay and good and healthy to grieve. You are an embodied soul with complex psychological and emotional and spiritual and physical dynamics at play, and it is not somehow more spiritual to deny how God has created you, to deny how God has wired you. There is a time to cry. And that quote talks about laughter, and laughter is healthy. There is a time to laugh. But the reason I'm focusing on the crying is because most of us don't try to tell people to get over it and stop laughing. We usually don't try to repress our laughter and tell people they got to move on. But we tend to do that with crying and grieving and mourning and sadness. We tend to want to avoid those things. And I think part of it is as Christians, sometimes I think we feel like we're not supposed to because we're supposed to have faith and hope and be happy about heaven. And a lot of times I think we get that from the 1 Thessalonians passage where Paul writes, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know that what will happen to believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope." But notice, I want to point out, he does not say, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died so that you do not grieve, period. No, he says, so you do not grieve like people who do not have hope. We do not grieve in hopeless despair. There is always hope when God is in the picture. God is always able to take what happens at the cross and bring resurrection life out of it. There is not hopelessness, but we don't grieve in hopelessness, but that doesn't mean we don't grieve. There is still grief that happens even for the believer. I love this scene in John's Gospel, chapter 11. There are these siblings that Jesus was really close friends with, two sisters, Mary and Martha, and then they had a brother, his name was Lazarus, and they lived in this town of Bethany. It was just a little bit outside of Jerusalem. So it's likely that whenever Jesus was in Jerusalem, in the city for the festivals and the holidays, and whenever his ministry took him through the region, he probably stopped at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' place. Maybe he even stayed there, but he definitely stopped there and had a meal. He was really close friends with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and they supported his ministry. And one point, though, Lazarus got sick. He became deathly ill. And Jesus had been in the region recently, and so Mary and Martha send word to Jesus to tell him, hey, Lazarus is sick. You need to come back. And they know he's healed people. So come back. This is an illness. We've seen you do it countless times. You could heal Lazarus. But for whatever reason, Jesus delays. And by the time Jesus shows up, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. You can almost hear the grief in Mary and Martha's voice as both of them, John tells us, both of them essentially say the same sentence to Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, he would not have died. As they're grieving this, they feel, Jesus, you've healed so many. Why not Lazarus? This passage is full of really beautiful gospel one-liners. It's in this passage where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Although you die, yet whoever believes in me, although they die, yet will they live. And then this story has a really happy ending too, because Jesus, he calls Lazarus from the land of the dead back into the land of the living, and he walks out of the tomb, grave clothes and all. It's like the first zombie story or something. And he raises Lazarus from the dead after he was dead for 4 days. And it's an amazing, beautiful miracle that honestly, I don't think my mind can even comprehend and imagine what that would be like to experience that. And this is a beautiful passage where all those things are there, and we often focus on that. But I want to look at verses 33 through 35. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. When Jesus saw their weeping, he saw people mourning and grieving. It tells us he was deeply troubled. The Greek word for troubled there is to have internal turmoil and anxiety. Jesus, God in the flesh, when he saw their grieving and their crying internally, he was deeply troubled and he wept. Again, the Greek word is not like he shed a little tear. Jesus cried. Don't miss the beauty of this, church. Because Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. If you want to know how God would respond in any given situation, look at how Jesus responds. And when God in human flesh encounters grief and he encounters people who are crying and mourning the loss of someone they love, he cries. He's troubled. And the most profound thing about this to me is he knows he's about to perform a miracle. And more than anyone else, he also knows about the reality and the glories of heaven. Yet he cried. Our Lord cried. Church, there is a time to cry. There is a time to grieve. And it's beautiful to know, I don't know why Jesus delayed and why he didn't heal him before he got to the point of dying. And similarly, I don't know why all the things that sometimes happen in our lives. But one of the beautiful things is that when we are grieving, God, Jesus, he is not indifferent to it. He is not unmoved. He's not untouched and unaffected, but God is with us in that grief. Jesus was deeply troubled and he cried. This morning, that is what I wanted to share. And again, it's not like this is not the most encouraging pick-me-up message, but I just want to acknowledge that we've all walked through loss, and maybe someone hasn't told you yet that it's okay to grieve. And that maybe you need to acknowledge and grieve. There is a time to cry. I want to share a couple helps and insights for those of you who might be grieving and those of you who might be walking with someone through grief. So this is sort of the practical things, but the overall message is God is with you. He's not indifferent, and there is sometimes a time to cry. But I want to share some practical things. If you're grieving, acknowledge your grief, acknowledge your loss. It's okay. It's not complaining to acknowledge it. It may turn into complaining, that is true. But in general, just beginning there and acknowledging the loss, acknowledging the grief, it's okay. Because that which is unaddressed is often goes to be that which is unhealed. Sometimes we have to address it in order for it to be healed, like a wound. There are wounds that sometimes need extra care, and if they go unaddressed, it actually delays the healing, or even worse, sometimes it provides opportunity for infection to set in. Similarly, if we have grief that we've unaddressed, sometimes it takes more time for it to heal, and then sometimes the enemy takes advantage of that. I have found that the enemy often takes advantage of our pain to get a foothold. Bitterness and unforgiveness and anger and despair and depression, they do not happen in a vacuum. Often they come in that place of our deepest wounds. And so we need to address and acknowledge our grief and our wounds and our pain so that they can be healed. Because if it's unaddressed, it may go unhealed. And then allow yourself to walk through the full process of grief. Again, like a wound, sometimes things take time to heal. And it's not the same as saying time heals all wounds. Because time does not heal all unaddressed wounds. Time can actually make them worse. But addressed wounds that are acknowledged with time, sometimes they take time to heal. I watched, it's probably been more than one show where this sort of scene happens, but I don't remember which one, but there's a TV show where like the character was really busy, had a lot going on at work, and they got sick, and they went to the doctor, and they're like, hey, prescribe me the most effective, quickest medication you can. And the doctor's like, so they could get back to their work and the busy, more important things. The doctor's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Sometimes we try to microwave fix things that take time. And grief is one of those, I think, in our culture sometimes. We try to microwave fix it. We want to just get through it. I want to tell you, allow yourself the time to process grief and healing. And this is one of the more important ones. Remember, you are not intended to walk through grief alone. There was a survey, and they found that over 50% of people said time with friends and family was extremely helpful. There were probably those who said somewhat or very helpful, somewhat helpful, but over 50% said it was extremely helpful. We are wired for a relationship, and we're not intended to walk through things alone. Yes, there are some things that you need to process in silence and solitude before God, but complete isolation is not healthy. And I know sometimes, though, there's people who don't understand, and they're maybe not helpful. And so finding a support group or those few friends or family members who do get it and do have the wisdom and discernment to be a comforting presence, it's okay to be selective, I guess is what I'm saying, with who you are around. But don't isolate. You're not intended to walk through it alone. And then lastly, trust that God will redeem all that you have lost. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4:17, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." And John the Apostle wrote in Revelation 21:4, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." And I don't share those scriptures as a quick pat, slap a scripture Band-Aid on the pain, but I do share them as an encouragement of the hope that we hold on to. And I want to be honest, I don't always know why some of the unspeakable things happen on this side of heaven, other than acknowledging that we live in a broken world that is not fully redeemed, and until God wraps up this age and introduces new creation, we will be touched by brokenness. But I don't have adequate answers for all the why questions that you or other people might have. But what I do believe is that whatever God permits you to walk through in life, He will redeem. That God, if He is who He says He is, then He will redeem everything you have lost, every tear you have shed, every wound that has been inflicted. He will redeem it, He will make it new, and it will be consumed by glory. And so we hold on to that. We trust that he will redeem all that you have lost. Allow yourself time to grieve. Acknowledge your grief. Allow yourself to process grief. Don't walk through it alone, and trust that God will redeem all that you have lost. If you are there for someone who's grieving, I want to share a couple do, not do tips and some things you probably should do if you want to be there for someone. Don't do this. Don't respond with trite, empty cliches and unsolicited advice. God needed another angel in heaven. They're in a better place now. God won't give you more than you can bear. Everything happens for a reason. Don't feel bad. Besides there being some significant theological errors in almost every single one of these statements, they're not helpful for someone who's walking through grief most of the time. They actually may do more to encourage them to repress their grief or feel like they got to get over it than actually help them process and walk through it. And then also, don't give people unsolicited advice. They probably aren't even in the frame of mind to be able to take your advice in any meaningful way. So don't offer pat, trite, cliche answers, and don't give unsolicited advice to someone who's walking through grief. If they ask for advice and they invite it, that's one thing. But sometimes we don't know what to say, so we just start, and sometimes it's not good. Don't presume to speak on behalf of God's will. This is a pet peeve of mine, and I want to be clear. I'm going to be clear on a couple things. There are theologians, there are pastors who would disagree with some of what I'm going to say. There are theologians and pastors who would agree with some of what I'm saying. So this is my understanding, but I believe God is sovereign over all of creation, over all of history, and his ultimate purposes will be accomplished. But I believe there's this mysterious reality in Scripture that is also taught that although God is sovereign over all of it, he has bestowed upon certain spiritual beings and human beings a degree of free will. And there are spiritual beings and there are human beings that are acting in rebellion to God's will and in opposition to God's will. So not everything that God permits to happen, do I believe, is God's will that it happens. I don't believe it's God's will that someone is killed by a drunk driver, or that a teen is killed by a mass shooting, or that a mom loses a child. Those are all the result of death, disease, and decay, which are invaders in God's good creation. They are a result of the fall. And so I do not believe I can even biblically say that everything that happens is God's will. Ultimately, it's under God's sovereignty. And ultimately, God works good. He is really good at taking dust and making life out of it. He is good at taking a cross and bringing resurrection. He's good at taking broken things and making things new out of it. And God redeems things. He restores things. He introduces new creation into things. But I don't believe God is directly willing things that are an invasion into his good creation. Jesus in his ministry, time and time again, confronts the kingdom of darkness and undoes its effects. He confronts nature and tells a storm to be at peace. He confronts demons who are afflicting people, and he confronts illness, and he counters it and brings it into submission to the kingdom of light. And so I just don't think it's helpful sometimes to tell someone who's grieving, oh, it's God's will. I think, no, it's why we ache for heaven. Because things are broken here, and this is why Jesus died. This is why God is making things new. Again, I know some, I'd love if you have questions about that. I know there are some theologians who would disagree. There are some pastors even who would, but I believe there are things that are acting in opposition to God's will, and he is ultimately going to bring all of it under his authority. And there are some things that happen that he is going to make new and bring goodness out of, but it wasn't his intended will. I think you confront that as soon as you get to Genesis chapter 3. and it all goes south from there. So don't presume to speak on behalf of God's will. Even if you don't agree with me, I think as humans we ought to be careful to presume to be able to speak on behalf of God sometimes. So even if you don't agree with everything I said, sometimes I don't want to presume to be able to speak about what God is or is not up to or doing. Don't try to fast-track the grief process for someone. Sometimes we're uncomfortable with grief and we just don't like when people are sad, so we try to tell them, like, feel better or be positive or think about this. And sometimes we try to rush it, but think about, a wound, a physical wound. If someone broke their arm, we wouldn't cut the cast off the next day and say, hey, you got to heal and get over it. No, we acknowledge some things take time. And so if you have a friend or family member who's grieving, allow them time to grieve. Don't try to, because you're uncomfortable with their grief, don't try to, do what I did to my wife when she was sad about our house. Tell them to move on. And then this is an important one. Don't take on the role of the Messiah. You can be a good friend and an encouragement and a comfort and a presence, but you are not God. You are not Jesus, and you cannot heal your friend or loved one, and you cannot undo what they've gone through. And sometimes we take on more weight than God has put on us and even designed us to have the capacity to carry. So don't take on the responsibility of being the Messiah in someone else's life, of rescuing them, of healing them. You are not God, so don't carry that. You don't need to. Here are some things you can do. Do listen. Sometimes part of what's necessary for someone to adequately process grief is just to have someone listen to them. So no advice, no answers, no explanations, just sometimes listening to someone else will do a lot for them. Be present. Be present. We're not wired for isolation, so sometimes just sitting there at the kitchen table, sitting in the living room, sitting across from them at the coffee shop, just sometimes being there is enough to remind them they are not alone. Be present. Do pray for them and with them. And it doesn't have to be, you don't always have to know what to pray. Just lift their name up before God. Hold them before God and allow your heart to empathize with them in intercession. And listen, God's healing work in their life is not dependent on you getting all the words right. You can just hold them before God, and if all you can say is their name, that is okay. Pray for them and with them. Do hug them and perform other tangible, practical actions. I think maybe in the era of COVID, you should maybe check before you hug them. But we're embodied souls with physical felt needs, and sometimes that physical embrace reminds us we're not alone, and sometimes that casserole for dinner just helps us not have one more thing to think about. And so do hug them. Do find tangible, practical ways. Maybe even just asking, what do you need right now? Things like that can go a long way. Listen, be present, pray for them, and hug them, and find other tangible ways to just be there for people. This morning, I want to invite you. We're going to listen to a song together. It's going to be a lyric video. And if you're not really in this place of grieving, or maybe you have been and you are in a more hopeful place, I just invite you, these lyrics, they declare and proclaim the hope we have. And so just read the lyrics, maybe sing along quietly, but hold on to that. Or if you know someone, maybe pray for them in this moment. If you are walking through grief, I invite you also to just engage the lyrics of the song, allow it to remind you of what is true. But then I also want to give opportunity. We have this thing we say, the altars are always open. If you feel prompted, I invite you can come to the altar. And if you're here and maybe an altar in church is kind of like maybe you didn't grow up and that was normal, or you're not sure what it means to come to the altar, it's just a way that we embody physically and outwardly the surrender that's going on inside. We come and we lay something down at the feet of Jesus and surrender it to him. And sometimes it's our sin. And so sometimes we come to the altar as an act of repentance, and we're laying our sin down before God. But sometimes people come to the altar because they need to lay down the burdens they're carrying. There's heavy things, there's stresses, there's anxiety, maybe there's sadness, maybe there's a situation, maybe there's a friend, maybe there's your grief. And if you feel prompted this morning, I just invite you to come, and the altar is just a place where you can lay that down. And it's just a way that we sort of act out that surrender that's happening on the inside. So I just invite you to respond however God in the Spirit might be prompting you this morning as we listen to this song.